Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is Andreas and Antonopouloss. I'm going to be your teacher for this, the 14th session of the massive open online course for the University of Nicosia's master's degree in digital currencies. I am so excited to be back with you teaching this course. As always, wonderful questions you have lined up for me. You may notice a few changes, trying to create a bit more of a studio experience here, so some technical changes have happened. I guess I had a lot of time during pandemic to fix things up a bit. You may also notice that I'm now wearing glasses, and that's not because it makes me look more scholarly or more like a professor. It's because I can't read when things are too close to my face. So, that's what's happening there. I hope you're all ready to do some learning today. Don't forget, in order to ask me questions, you have to put them in the question forums, discuss them with your other colleagues and fellow students, and prepare in advance. So I hope you're going to have even more great questions for me next week. Let's get started. Let me just make sure all of our video and audio is working well and everything looks good. And we'll start with our first question. Mining after 21 million Bitcoin. Elijah asks, once the 21 million Bitcoin have been mined, will there be any need for miners? If yes, what will be the benefit of miners? Elijah, great question. In fact, if there was ever a frequently asked questions Hall of Fame, this question is probably the one question most people ask when first exposed to Bitcoin. It's a very, very common question. So it arises from two misunderstandings about the role of miners and the purpose of mining. So the first one is a misunderstanding about the role of miners. Miners are not a mechanism for issuing Bitcoin. That is a side effect, and it is in fact the reward mechanism that encourages mining, but the primary purpose of mining is to secure the Bitcoin chain. What miners do is they provide security, and that security is rewarded with new Bitcoin or with transaction fees. And that's the second big misunderstanding. New Bitcoin is only part of the reward. So when we talk about reward for miners, there are two aspects to that reward. In every block, part of the reward is what is known as the block subsidy. The block subsidy is new Bitcoin created in that block. The other part of the reward is transaction fees. And the total reward that a miner receives for mining a block is subsidy plus transaction fees. Now, the ratio of the subsidy to the transaction fees changes all the time. Transaction fees go up and down, whereas block subsidy reduces every 4 years by half. What that means is that over time, miners rely more and more on transaction fees. There have been times in the recent past when transaction fees have made up more than half of the block reward, and in some cases have even exceeded the block subsidy as part of the reward. This is part of Satoshi Nakamoto's original plan. Satoshi Nakamoto predicted that over time, fees would dominate the reward, and miners continue to mine because their function is to provide security, even after all the Bitcoin have been mined, because they continue to mine blocks and get paid with transaction fees. Now, this creates a bunch of other questions like, does that mean that the transaction fees are going to be very high because you can only fit so many transactions in a block? And for all of those questions, really the simple answer is we don't know yet. And it's almost impossible to predict how Bitcoin will evolve between now and 140 years in the future when the last Bitcoin is mined. What we do know is that an effective transaction fee market already exists, and some uses of Bitcoin, such as layer 2 networks, which we'll discuss later in this course, may shift the way transaction fees are implemented. All right, I'm going to check in the chat, make sure everybody's having fun, if you can hear me well, and all of that. I don't see any complaints, so I must assume that everything is going well. Our next question comes from Danilis. Danilis asks, so miners hold 80% of all the Bitcoin out there as of now. Probably while the halving of reward happens, miners will start to drop out and they'll probably start selling their Bitcoin to start enjoying their life. Maybe, maybe not. If that's the case, how will the price of Bitcoin be affected? Danilis, this is a common misunderstanding that miners hold Bitcoin. In fact, miners don't hold Bitcoin. Even though they earn Bitcoin as part of the block reward, the majority of the Bitcoin they earn, they have to sell. And the reason they have to sell it is because they have to pay for electricity. Now you might be thinking, how much of a cost is electricity? And of course, in mining, it is the biggest cost that miners have. If you think about the mining market as an efficient market, under an efficient market hypothesis, as supply and demand meet each other based on price in an open market with ample competition, there is an expectation that profit margins, which is what's left over after the miner has paid for electricity, will converge to zero. In efficient markets, the profit becomes smaller and smaller because if you have very large profits, all that does is it attracts more competition. And we've seen that play out in the Bitcoin mining space. On average, miners make very little profit. On average, meaning that if you take the average profit margin of all of the miners, they make very little profit. Although, of course, some miners are very profitable and others are barely profitable and sometimes unprofitable for short periods of time. So what does that mean? That means that miners don't hold 80% of the Bitcoin. In fact, they sell probably more than 80% of the Bitcoin they earn in every block in order to pay for electricity. And they only keep a small percentage. This is the daily supply of Bitcoin. 144 blocks times 6.25 Bitcoin per block plus transaction fees is put onto the market, several $1 million worth of Bitcoin every day as supply. And just for the price of Bitcoin to remain stable, that means that there have to be buyers to buy all of that Bitcoin every day. And there are. In fact, in many cases, the buyers exceed the available supply, and that leads to price appreciation. It is unlikely you'll see miners drop out during the halving. We just had one, and as in previous halvings, it was very much a non-event. We had predicted that when the halving happened, because miners have priced this into their profitability models for a very long time, when the reward halving happens, nothing much changes in the market. And that's exactly what happened this time. Again, if anything, what we saw is the price shoot up and more hashing power being deployed into the network, more hash rate. Similar question from John. John asks, would mining of Bitcoin continue once Bitcoin reaches 21 million issued, since that is a maximum? Yes, it will continue, and it will continue because mining is a security mechanism, and miners continue to get reward, and they get reward through transaction fees instead of new Bitcoin. The other important thing to realize is that there is a ratio between the block subsidy and the transaction fees, and I think of that, if you put it on a chart, as an X. So you have the block subsidy that drops every 4 years and becomes smaller and smaller and smaller on one axis, and then you have transaction fees that rise as more utilization of the network occurs. And there is a crossover point. That crossover point is when miners start earning more in transaction fees than in block subsidy. And if you think about this X graph, the crossover point happens way before 140 years have passed, way before the last Bitcoin has been mined. In fact, we've already seen that crossover happen a couple of times historically. And so what we would anticipate is that long before the last Bitcoin is mined, miners have already effectively started relying on transaction fees as the majority of their income. And of course, they continue to mine. There's no reason not to. New Bitcoin becomes less and less and less important over time. And so when the last Satoshi is mined, it's not a big event. Nothing much has changed. If you think about it, miners have spent 4 years at that point mining only 1 Satoshi per block in their reward. And previous to that, they had spent 4 years mining only 2 Satoshis per block. And previous to that, they had spent years mining only 4 Satoshis per block. At that point, if you assume the average transaction, even if you assume the minimum transaction fee of 1 Satoshi for a transaction, that's pretty much the minimum you could do, and you assume a couple thousand transactions in a block, which again is today's standards, probably a lot more, orders of magnitude more transactions per block, you're looking at fees making up 2,000–3,000 Satoshis. Even at the minimum level of fee, even with the current level of transactions, whereas the block subsidy has been well below 2,000 Satoshis for decades. And therefore, this is a non-event. It approaches very, very gradually, and it is a very smooth switchover that happens on a profitability calculation, if you think about it, that miners perform every single day. Every single day. Today included. Miners look at how much they make from fees, how much they make from block subsidy, how much they have to pay in electricity, in hardware, maintenance, operations, and staff salaries, and they decide, am I profitable today? Is this particular mining machine profitable today? And if they find that some of their mining machines are not profitable, they turn them off. It's as simple as that. And they keep the ones that are profitable running. And that calculation happens every day, which means that every day, hundreds, thousands of machines are turned off and thousands of new mining machines are turned on as miners recalculate their profitability across the board. All right, let me take a quick break and let's check into the chat and see how things are going. All right, you seem to be having fun and you seem to be responding to the things I'm saying, which means, by extension, my video and audio is reaching you. You know, that's the power of deduction, the scientific process played out right there. You are listening, therefore, you can hear me. Good stuff. All right, Samson asks, is there a limit to the number of miners for a block? Let's assume that by miners here you don't mean people, but machines. But we could also answer this question if by miners you meant people, organizations, companies, actors, if you like. The answer for all of those is no. There's no limit to the number of participants in the mining because there's no central participation. There's no central control over participation. Let's think about this a bit differently. When miners are trying to find a solution to a block, they're not trying to find a solution to the same block. Each miner creates their own candidate block with their own coin-based transaction that rewards them, with their own set of transactions in a particular order. And they're not going to be exactly the same. They will have some similarity. So I create a block, and 98% perhaps of the transactions in my block are also in the blocks of most other miners. But there might be a bit of variation. I might have a couple extra transactions. They might have a few less or a few fewer transactions. And I might have them in a slightly different order. All of these things produce blocks that are different. Different in one important way, their hash is different. Which means that when we start trying to solve proof of work, we're each trying in a completely different set of hashes. One way to think about this might be a useful analogy is by thinking of the game bingo. If you know how bingo works, each player in bingo has a card with some random set of numbers on that card. And they have an announcer that's drawing numbers for their bingo game. Are they restricted in how many people can play bingo? No. You can have 10 people playing. You can have 10,000 people playing. You could have 10 million people playing. And depending on the size of the bingo card, you could adjust it so that the probability of somebody finding a solution every 10 minutes is always the same. More people playing, bigger bingo cards. And as a result, you can get an idea of both the fact that each player is acting independently, as well as the fact that the probability of success changes over time, which is the difficulty adjustment that happens in Bitcoin. I've used similar analogies. If you don't like bingo, you can think of this as Sudoku. Again, another game of skill plus chance. In Sudoku, what you're doing is you're starting with a random card. If it's a bigger card, it takes longer to solve. So if you had more players playing, you would just make the Sudoku cards bigger, and as a result, you calibrate it so that no matter how many players you have, you always get someone winning on average every 10 minutes. It's as simple as that. That's the mechanism that works. Miners don't coordinate, they compete, which means that nobody knows how many miners are out there trying. We only see the winner. We don't see any of the losers. What we do know, based on the amount of effort that goes in, we can deduce how much hash rate is out there, because that determines the difficulty. So no, there's no limit to the number of miners for a block at all. All right, here we go with one more question. This question comes from Subra. Subra asks, what empowers a Bitcoin holder to be a miner? Is there a minimum BTC holding criteria for an individual company to be a miner? Please explain the mining process in a simple language. Who can do mining? Why someone will put time and energy into mining? How is mining different from buying BTC? Great question, Subra. This is really something that is not easy to understand, and I know a lot of people have difficulty understanding the mining process. It seems like a strange and convoluted way to run this system. But you've got to realize the purpose of mining is very specific. The purpose of mining isn't to earn Bitcoin. The purpose of mining, for Bitcoin at least, is to provide security to the network without centralizing that function. So decentralized security. It allows miners to participate without us knowing who the miners are, to enforce the rules and play fair, because only by playing fair do they have a chance of reward, and to get punished for not playing fair by losing the energy that they consume trying to mine. That mechanism ensures that anyone can participate, that the network dynamically adjusts regardless of how many participants exist, and that no one has ultimate central control or power over Bitcoin. And that applies to any consensus algorithm that works through proof of work. What you're describing here is a holder being a miner, or a minimum amount of Bitcoin to be a miner. Sounds a bit more like proof of stake, which we'll cover in future sessions. And proof of stake is not used in Bitcoin, meaning that to be a miner, you don't need to hold any Bitcoin at all. What you need is the ability to compute hashes really, really fast. Now, theoretically at least, you could compute hashes on a laptop like this. And theoretically, I might win. It's a bit like playing a very, very difficult lottery. If I was running mining on this laptop, I might eventually find a block. But because my chances of finding a block with so little computing power as I can get on my laptop, and because of the cost of electricity that will consume, it's not going to be profitable. By the time I actually find a block on average, based on the probability of me finding a block, I've probably spent more money on electricity than the block reward that I would earn. So there's no point in me doing it with this equipment. In order to be competitive, I need equipment that can hash very efficiently, in terms of how much energy it uses. And to get a chance of finding a block relatively quickly, I need a lot of this equipment. Or I need to pool my efforts with others so that we all mine together and share in the reward whenever a block is found. So that involves special equipment. That special equipment is called mining equipment. And it's basically application-specific integrated circuits, or ASICs, which are chips that do nothing but SHA-256 hashing. And they do it very, 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 very fast. Terahashes per second. Although a more important metric is how much energy you use for every terahash of hashing that you can achieve. Because that will ultimately determine your profitability as a miner. So, what empowers a Bitcoin holder to be a miner? Nothing. Anyone can be a miner. All they have to do is essentially buy equipment to do mining. A friend of mine recently bought some mining equipment that isn't particularly efficient from the previous generation of mining equipment, because they could find it inexpensively, and are mining in their home in one of the northern countries in Europe where it is cold. And so what they're doing essentially there is they're using their mining equipment as an electric heater. It seems weird, but if you think about it, in this particular northern country, all heating is done by electricity. It's a requirement by law that all heating is done by electricity for environmental reasons. And therefore, if you're going to use electricity to heat, why not also mine? A miner, effectively, is a machine that converts electricity into both Bitcoin and heat, and does so very efficiently. It's a heater that also produces Bitcoin. So if you're going to use the energy anyway to heat, why not also make a bit of Bitcoin? Now, we're talking a very, very, very small amount of Bitcoin, which, if that miner wasn't used for heating, wouldn't make much sense. Why would anyone do mining? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, if you do it on an industrial scale where you install thousands of mining hardware systems, thousands of ASICs in a giant warehouse with megawatts of electricity going in, you can make quite good money on this. There are companies that have made more than $1 billion doing this over the past several years. So that's one reason why you might do it. Why would an individual do it? Well, either because they've got very cheap electricity, or because they need to use the electricity for heating anyway, and they will use the heat coming out of the mining equipment to do something else, like heat water or heat their house. Or finally, because they want to buy Bitcoin, but effectively buy Bitcoin in the most anonymous and clean way possible. If you think about it, the Bitcoin that appears as a block reward is Bitcoin that has no history, and it's given anonymously to the person who mined it. And so that's a great way to basically buy Bitcoin by buying hardware that mines Bitcoin and get perfectly clean, brand new Bitcoin in a block that has no history, and get it anonymously. So some people do it for that reason. There's lots of different reasons why people might choose to do it. But then again, there's also lots of reasons why people won't choose to do it. And here's my little announcement. You may have heard me say this before. I have been in Bitcoin since 2012, early 2013. I have never mined Bitcoin. Simple as that. I have never mined Bitcoin. Why? Because it's not something that I'm particularly interested in doing, because it requires investment of time and skill into hardware and maintaining this hardware, and it's not something that appeals to me. I'm not interested in running these loud computers that make lots of fan noise. If I wanted to do that, what I'd probably do is get a new NVIDIA GPU and run Microsoft Flight Simulator and listen to the fans spin while I fly through the skies. Mining doesn't appeal to me personally. All right, quick check in the chat. Let's see if everybody's enjoying, if there are any follow-up questions. Yeah, we got another follow-up question. Let me quickly ask this one. Bassam Wazir asks, wouldn't solar power be a solution for mining? Absolutely, it would. Again, it involves the expenditure of capital. You have to buy solar panels, and you have to also buy miners. But once you buy solar panels and miners, now the energy that you're using for mining is basically free. So yes, you could use solar power. In fact, that would be an ideal way because you would be able to utilize that solar power even if there is not enough consumption in the place where you've deployed it. Let me give you an example. Where do you put solar power? You certainly don't put it in London. Not enough sun. You'd probably put it in the middle of the desert in Arizona, in Nevada, in the Sahara, in Morocco, in Algeria, in Egypt. Lots of great sunny places. So you put a solar panel there. Great. Now you've made lots of electricity. Who do you sell it to? Turns out the places that are really, really sunny in the middle of the desert aren't places that are very suitable for human habitation and don't have large human populations. So other than a few solar plants outside of Las Vegas where you've got a big city, most solar plants have this problem, which is if you deploy solar and there's no one to consume the energy, it's not worth the investment. But if you have the ability to deploy solar and use it for Bitcoin mining, you can use the electricity when there isn't enough consumption and sell it to consumers when there is enough consumption, and therefore you can amortize your costs. It's a very interesting proposition. It's one of the examples of how environmental concerns can actually drive Bitcoin to places for alternative energy. Jeff asks, given that the vast majority of mining functions are performed in China, how valid are concerns, risks of government interference in mining, and consequently loss of independence of the Bitcoin network? Jeff, this is a question that comes up a lot. So first, let's look at the assumptions. There is sometimes a confusion of terms. What we do know is that more than half of the mining pools are located in China, primarily because mining pools are relatively easy to locate. You can look at a mining pool and you can say, that is being operated by an entity on a network in China. That's not mining, though. Mining pools are not miners. And if you try to shut down a mining pool, it can simply move somewhere else, or its mining capacity can move and switch to another pool. There's no entry or exit barrier to a mining pool. It's very frictionless to move to another one. So, in fact, exerting control over mining pools really isn't a very effective mechanism to do anything in this particular space. As for the mining power itself, the hash rate, it is probably the case that a percentage of mining hash rate is located in China, probably more than 50%. We don't know exactly how much. And the reason we don't know exactly how much is precisely because of the anonymous and decentralized nature of mining. It's not possible to see where hash rate is actually installed. Of course, you can hide that with VPNs and various other mechanisms. So we don't really know where the majority of the hash rate is. It is possible that it is in China, and that has to do with the historical development of the Bitcoin network. In the early days, when ASICs were very, very difficult to source and produce fast enough, and when the advancements in ASICs were moving very fast, it suited a mining producer to be in an area that gave them three fundamental advantages. The first one was access to cheap electricity, which China has quite a lot of. The second was access to cheap labor to utilize all of these things. And the third one, most importantly, was proximity to silicon fabrication plants where ASICs could be built, shipped, and installed as quickly as possible. Because in the early days, these ASICs were obsolete within 3 to 6 months because a newer version with higher density chips would come out every 6 months. That's no longer the case. And the reason it's no longer the case is because ASICs eventually reached the front end of Moore's law. The maximum density of chips, of transistors per chip, has reached almost the cutting edge of GPUs and CPUs. So today we see miners being manufactured at 16 and 12 nanometer facilities, whereas GPU and CPU are, all the way down to 7 in some cases. Not a huge difference. What that means is that now ASIC equipment lasts for 2 years, which means you can export it from the silicon fabrication plants, which are almost all in China, to other countries and still make profitable use of it. And we've seen the emergence of big mining facilities on hydroelectric in Canada and other places. In the United States, based on cheap oil from places like Texas, where they use fracking to extract shale oil, and places where solar can be used, perhaps even wind. So mining is becoming a bit more decentralized since 2016 as ASIC manufacturing became more long-term concern. So that's one part of it, which is the question of, does the majority of mining occur in China? Yes, maybe, we're not entirely sure, but it's probably decreasing, and the centrality of China is less and less over time in this particular space. The second part is, what about interference? Government interference in mining and loss of independence of the Bitcoin network. There are a lot of misunderstandings about what exactly you can do with a 51% attack. Here's what you can't do. You can't change the rules of Bitcoin. You can't issue more Bitcoin than you should issue. You can't pay yourself out of transactions without actually owning the Bitcoin. You can't simply steal other people's Bitcoin. You can't create false transactions or invalid transactions or false blocks. The main thing that government interference in mining could achieve is denial of service attacks, basically mining of empty blocks. And that wouldn't be a very effective thing. First of all, they would have to find the miners and coerce them into participating in this scheme with the hope of exceeding 51% of the hash rate. And, finding the miners and coercing them, yeah, maybe it's possible, but that would represent China killing a strategic goose that lays golden eggs, as well as trying to overcome the very strong possibility that local officials would be simply bribed to look the other way and continue mining operations. You've got to understand that in some of the places where this mining is happening, this represents a very significant source of tax revenue, and while it is known to the local officials, they could easily turn a blind eye for a nice, big, fat bribe. So that's another thing. Can the Chinese government simply go in and coerce all these miners? Probably, but not very effectively, not all of the time. And then what would happen to the rest of the Bitcoin network? Well, that depends, but certainly the rest of the Bitcoin network wouldn't just sit still and take that kind of interference. A sustained 51% attack is very difficult to do, and there are enough sources of hash rate outside of China that you could see very strong opposition to such an attack. And ultimately, that attack would achieve very little. It would only achieve denial of service for as long as the attack continued, and it would lead to countermeasures. And those countermeasures could be varied. They could involve some kind of proof of stake or proof of authority add-on to Bitcoin, where in addition to proof of work, a block would have to have a signature proving that it was not one of the rogue miners who are trying to destroy the network. A little countermeasure like that would actually put a big kibosh on the plans of ruining mining for Bitcoin, at which point the Chinese government has now spent perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars building all of these ASICs for a short-lived attack that ends up proving that Bitcoin is more resilient than anyone thought. And that's the final point, which is that if you try to attack the big boss, you'd better take him down. Because if you attack and fail, you're in deep trouble. And that applies to these types of non-state systems. a failed attack on Bitcoin is much worse than no attack on Bitcoin, because a failed attack of Bitcoin fundamentally proves and strengthens the narrative that Bitcoin is resistant to direct attack. If Bitcoin survives an attack like that, and it's not for sure, we might have to reboot a new currency, but if it does, that does a lot more damage to any government that tries to attack it than simply leaving it alone. Because then everybody looks at Bitcoin and goes, huh, so it can survive. That's interesting. I do a quick time check and jump in the chat again. Lots of comments in the chat. All right, I still have plenty of questions to answer from the ones you've supported all week. Just so you know, I'm going to answer questions that have been submitted during the week in the forums the right way. I take a look in the chat to see if there are any follow-up questions, but I won't actually switch and start answering questions from the chat unless there's either a very relevant follow-up that emphasizes an important point, or I run out of questions that you asked during the week. It is important that you ask the questions in advance. That gives not only your fellow students an opportunity to discuss and think about these issues and learn from each other, but it also gives me an opportunity to prepare, filter, and sort the best questions. So please ask them in advance, and please don't be offended if I'm not answering your question in the chat. Let's see. Antonopouloss asks, why are hashes so important? What is the purpose of hashes? Why are they so important? Well, hashes are cryptographic algorithms that take an arbitrary length stream of data, basically a whole bunch of bits, and they compress and transform them into a fingerprint, or hash as it's known, which is a fixed size piece of data that is an absolute characterization or summary of the stream of data without revealing anything about it. What does that mean? That means you take a document or a block and you put it through a hashing algorithm. No matter what the size of the document, block, hard drive, application, software, binary stream, speech, sound, or video you put into this hash algorithm, it will always produce 256 bits, in the case of SHA-256. And these 256 bits depend on every bit in that binary input, meaning that if you change anything, even one bit, somewhere, anywhere in that data stream, it will produce a completely different hash from a completely different part of the 256-bit number space. That's how it works. Why is it useful? Well, hashes are useful for two main reasons within cryptocurrencies and blockchains. The first one is for fingerprinting. If you want to sign a transaction with a digital signature, what you're signing is not the transaction, what you're signing is the hash. So hashes are used to fingerprint data. And if you then apply a digital signature to that fingerprint, you can prove that that fingerprint hasn't changed because of the digital signature, and that means that you can connect it to data in a way that someone can verify. I can take that data, I can produce a fingerprint, compare it, see that it's the exact same fingerprint that was produced by someone else, and that it bears a digital signature that means it can't change. This happens in block headers, in transaction IDs, inside the inputs in signatures, in transactions, and various other places in the cryptographic ecosystem of blockchains. So what hashes do is they fingerprint, and then with digital signatures, we can sign those fingerprints and make sure the data is exactly as it is. The reason hashes are useful in this way is because it takes very little effort to verify a hash. So the effort to produce a hash from a piece of data and verify it is very, very small. What other purpose hashes serve is in the proof of work algorithm, and this is because a unique and weird way that hashes work that is not particularly intuitive, but was formalized by the work of Adam Back in a system called Hashcash, as well as others before Adam Back and since, and finally by Satoshi Nakamoto in Bitcoin, in the proof of work algorithm. And this is that when you take data and you hash it, you can't predict what the hash will look like. It's going to be effectively a pseudo-random number. It will look like you picked a random number, but it's not random. It comes from the data you put in exactly a predictable way. Anybody else can put the same data in, get the same hash, but you can never predict what it's going to look like. It's a 256-bit number, an enormous number, and that number appears to be random. So you never know what hash you're going to produce. That creates an interesting possibility, which is, what if you expect the hash to look a certain way? Let's say, for example, you say, I want you to produce hashes, but I'm only going to accept as valid hashes that start with 0. All right, well, how many hashes start with 0? Let's think of this as binary. It's 256 binary digits. And what are the chances that the first digit is a 0? Well, for every hash you do, approximately half of them will have 0, and the other half will have 1 as the first binary digit. Simple math, right? It's a 50-50 coin toss. And so if you continuously hash things and you produce hashes by changing the input data a tiny bit, you will produce hashes that start with 0, or start with 1, or start with 0. It's almost like flipping a coin. Now let's say you wanted to say the first 2 binary digits are 0. Well, that's going to be 1 in every 4. So again, now you have 2 binary digits, so it's 2 squared, and 2 squared is 4. So that's how many of the hashes. 1 in 4 is going to be starting with 2 zeros. And if you now start hashing different data, you have a 1 in 4 probability that your hash starts with 2 zeros. So interestingly enough, you've created a system that is a probability machine. It's a bit like a lottery. If you put inputs into that hash, finding a hash that has a specific pattern, like say 16 zero binary digits at the beginning of the hash output, what are the chances of that? If you think about it, 2 to the 16 binary digits, the chances of all of them being 0 at the beginning of the hash will be 1 in 2 to the 16. You can do the math for yourselves and figure out that's a pretty low probability. It's like drawing a lottery ticket. And even though it's very difficult to find that one hash that has that peculiar pattern, because you have to try lots and lots and lots of inputs until, just by coincidence, one of them produces a hash that has that pattern in the beginning. It's very easy for someone to then verify. All you have to do is show them which input worked, and they will know that, yes, indeed, if you take that exact input, it produces a hash with 16 zeros at the beginning. It may have taken you billions of tries to find that, but it only took the other person one try. They just hash it once and confirm that it is correct. This asymmetry is fundamental. So if you do that again and again and again, okay, in this particular case, I was talking about just 16 binary digits, so we're talking about 65,535 attempts on average before you find a hash that works that way. So it's not a huge amount of work, but as you can see, you can vary that amount of work very, very much. All you have to do is expect more zeros in the beginning, and it gets harder and harder and harder to find a match. For every 0 you add at the beginning, it's twice as hard to find a matching hash. And yet, verification still only takes one hashing operation. That trick is proof of work. That trick is proof of work. That trick is what miners do. Miners are expected to find a block hash that hashes all of the elements of the block and produces a hash that magically has lots of zeros in the beginning. That's the difficulty target. In order to do that, they have no choice but to simply keep trying, changing the input slightly by changing one of the numbers in there, again and again and again and again, and doing this trillions and trillions of times per second across thousands of miners across the world, so that eventually, after 15 exahashes have been calculated, one of them, just by coincidence, happens to start with a sufficient number of zeros to be acceptable to everybody in the network. But now everybody can verify that, not by doing exahashes worth of calculations, but by doing 1 hash to verify. Exahashes to produce, 1 hash to verify. And with that 1 hash, simply by counting the probabilities, you know that exahashes of work were required, which means that that number, on its own, without any other effort, is proof that work was done. Exahashes worth of work. You can calculate how much work was done based on that one number, the hash, the results from it, and you can say, this is proof of work. And that's the algorithm in Bitcoin. That's why hashes are so important in proof-of-work blockchains. Now, let's go to a related question by Mark. Mark asks, in Bitcoin, is the nonce generated as a function of what time it is when the node seeks to generate a nonce? Also, while mining, when a node hashes the hash of the last block plus the block of transactions plus the nonce, do all nodes seek to hash the same block of transactions, or do these ledger entries differ between different nodes in the same way that the nonce does? That's a great question, Mark. You're beginning to grasp some of these nuances. It's a really fascinating topic, isn't it? All right, so no. Different mining nodes are not mining the same block of transactions. As I mentioned in a previous answer, they will all differ slightly. Each mining node produces a candidate block. They produce this candidate block in much the same way in the beginning. The hash of the last block is the same, because they're all building on the same parent, or they should all be building on the same parent if they're all up to date on the chain. The block of transactions, however, they fill themselves. They take a number of transactions from the mempool, the pool of unconfirmed transactions, the transactions that are waiting to be included in a block, the queue, which they've built themselves. Each node is waiting for transactions to show up that have not been confirmed and builds a queue. Each mining node then picks some of those transactions. How do they pick? Well, they mostly use the same mechanism. They pick the transactions that are going to be most profitable for them to include in a block. But they're not going to be exactly the same transactions. They may put them in a slightly different order. They may have a few extra transactions that they've seen that other miners haven't seen, or vice versa. They may have fewer transactions than other miners. So there will be differences. The candidate blocks will be subtly different. One of the transactions for sure is different, and that's the Coinbase transaction. When a miner constructs a candidate block, they create a Coinbase transaction that says, pay me. And they put their own address in the Coinbase transaction. Now, that doesn't really mean anything, but if they actually prove and find proof of work for that block, then that block becomes real. And then the Coinbase transaction that says pay me becomes a real transaction that actually pays me. So if you think about it, each candidate block is slightly different in terms of what transaction it includes, and is for sure different in terms of the Coinbase transaction because it pays a different address, the address of the miner who built that candidate. So all of the miners create a candidate block of their own. They all put their own Bitcoin address as the recipient of the reward, hoping that one day that block is real and therefore they get paid. They put a bunch of transactions in that will probably overlap by 98%. And then they put a nonce. What nonce? Doesn't really matter. You could start at 0 and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because there's a timestamp, there's a Coinbase, there's a mix of transactions, you're going to be trying a different solution from everybody else, almost guaranteed. Unless by some crazy coincidence you have exactly the same information. But given the Coinbase and the fact that you have your miner's recipient address, that's not going to happen. If you have a miner who has multiple machines, they may set it up so that they start at a different nonce. In fact, you'd want that. You wouldn't want all of the machines starting at the same nonce, because then they're just duplicating each other's work if the candidate blocks are identical. So essentially, you put all of these things into the mix and you produce a hash. The nonce usually starts at 0, but you could start at the other end. You could start at 4 billion and start going down. You could start somewhere in the middle. With modern ASIC equipment, you will run out of nonce space very, very quickly. Usually in just a few seconds, you would run out of nonce space because you will go through 4 billion calculations. In fact, you'd go through 4 billion calculations in less than a second. So you run out of nonce. Then what? Well, there's some extra nonce space in the Coinbase, and you'd run out of that pretty quickly too, and then you'd have to change something else. Miners will use other parts of the Coinbase. They may reorder the transaction slightly to change that fingerprint. They may also change the timestamp by updating it in the block. The timestamp doesn't have to be precise, so they can use that clock function in there to also skew. All of these things are changing information in the candidate block, and all you need to do is change one bit somewhere other than the nonce, and then you can try all of the nonces again in order to produce another 4 billion guesses of that, plus another times 4 billion guesses for the extra nonce, plus another guess for a slightly different timestamp, maybe 1 second later, 1 second before, or whatever. So the miners are automatically changing several parts of the block header every time they run out of nonce space, and they basically are just grinding those hashes as fast as possible. Over time, it may be necessary to change the block header structure in order to provide more nonce space in a way that doesn't require some of these tricks, such as skewing the clock or reordering the transactions, in order to continue to grind with ASICs as the hash rate increases. In the beginning, it was easy. You just ran through the 32 bits of nonce. But then miners just kept getting faster and faster, and nowadays it takes a lot more to do that. Gregory asks, at what point do you think that the miners will have to step away from SHA-256? I assume that computational power will evolve in such a way that SHA-256 will no longer be sufficient to produce hashes that are complex enough to solve in about 10 minutes. Yeah, that's not going to happen. So that we don't have to worry about that. And the reason we don't have to worry about that is because grinding through 256 bits in a brute force way, that's 10 to the 77, that's as many atoms as there are in the observable universe, also known as the Eddington number. It's such an enormous number, you can't even wrap your head around it, and don't worry about that. That's not the issue. Getting to a point where SHA-256 isn't big enough to be able to run the hash rate is not going to happen, because the amount of energy you would need to use in order to simply flip that many bits, even if you were just counting through hashes and not doing any other computation, you were just trying to count through a 256-bit number, not happening. The physics of it require an amount of energy that exceeds the amount of energy that is existent in our solar system. You could turn the sun into a dynamo and you still wouldn't have enough energy to flip 256 bits simply by counting from 1 to 10 to the 77. SHA is not going to run out of computational power. However, and the second part of your question addresses this, do you feel quantum computing might accelerate this, and will the Bitcoin community easily adapt to a new cryptography solution? Quantum computing is actually going to affect the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm long before it affects SHA-256. So yes, we do need to worry about quantum computing in Bitcoin in the long term, but not because of SHA. Hashing algorithms are not easily solved with quantum computers. They're not the kind of algorithm that is very susceptible to quantum solutions. Elliptic curve, however, or discrete logarithm problems, prime factorization problems, and other problems that are used in public key cryptography, such as elliptic curve cryptography, are incredibly susceptible to quantum algorithms. I mean, the quantum algorithms are pretty straightforward to do discrete logarithm solutions. So, elliptic curve digital signature algorithm, that falls apart long before SHA does. If there is a quantum computer, it will be able to solve elliptic curve digital signature. Basically, it will allow you to produce a digital signature without a private key, or rather, to be more clear, it will allow you to simply calculate a private key from the public key by reversing the elliptic curve multiplication. So at that point, elliptic curve cryptography is useless. Now, in order for that to happen, you need a quantum computer that can have enough qubits to attack the elliptic curve of Bitcoin. Not easy. And in fact, there is no indication that any such computer is imminent in the next 10 to 15 years. So, where quantum computing becomes a problem is in quantum factorization of the public key, and that will need to be solved, and that will need to be solved by introducing new signature formats. Now, these blockchains are modular, so you can actually introduce a new digital signature format. In fact, just a week ago, the Schnorr signature format was merged into Bitcoin Core's library so that it can be implemented on the Sept P256K1 elliptic curve. Schnorr signatures are a different type of signature than elliptic curve digital signature, and they're being introduced over probably the next 2 years as an alternative way of signing because it has a number of efficiencies and space optimizations for Bitcoin. So there's no reason why, in a similar way, we can't introduce a quantum-resistant digital signature algorithm into Bitcoin as an upgrade to the scripting language. In fact, that's probably exactly what's going to happen. The difficulty isn't in introducing a quantum-resistant digital signature algorithm. The difficulty lies in migrating all the existing coins that are locked under a non-quantum resistant algorithm, and that requires massive coordination and logistics. Basically, anybody who doesn't migrate their coins will lose them as soon as a quantum computer can simply crack them. And many of these coins are lost already, meaning the private keys have been lost, the owners are dead, accidents, including unfortunate boating accidents, have resulted in the loss of private keys, and all of these things mean that those coins that are currently dead and cannot be spent in any way because the private keys are lost, suddenly become spendable. And there's no way to migrate those to quantum-resistant signatures. Ironically enough, the first indication we have that a quantum computer is able to reverse public keys might be the fact that coins that are considered long lost or inert, like Satoshi Nakamoto's own Bitcoin, might start moving, and that would be the first flag that such activity is possible. I think Bitcoin has a long way to go and can evolve to solve these problems in elegant ways. None of these, in my opinion, are insurmountable problems, and I'm of the opinion that quantum computing and quantum-resistant algorithms are a consideration for 10 to 15 years down the road, and not now. And in fact, trying to prematurely optimize to solve a problem that doesn't yet exist when there are other much bigger priorities is a mistake. By the way, I've been roundly criticized for that opinion as basically giving people a false sense of safety and ignoring the imminent threat of quantum computing. Most of this criticism is coming from people who are promoting quantum-resistant blockchains that are alternatives to Bitcoin. So there may be some motivation there, and I have my own biases. But that's the best answer I can give you right now. And with that, we have reached the end of our session. Thank you so much for watching. This is MOOC 14, the Massively Open Online course, the 14th semester iteration of this course, which is open for anyone around the world in order to participate in learning about Bitcoin and open blockchains, as well as about all other aspects of the economics and emerging technology in this space. as part of the University of Nicosia's master's degree in digital currencies. Thank you so much for attending today. Thank you for the excellent questions you've asked. I encourage you to ask questions for next week's session in the forums in advance and discuss them with your fellow students and learn from each other while giving me plenty of time to prepare my answers. I'm Andreas and Antonopouloss. It's been my pleasure teaching you this course today, and I look forward to seeing you next Friday. Bye-bye, everyone. Oh, next Thursday. Bye-bye, everyone. We'll just cut that out of the final video. No one will ever notice that mistake.